The Everglades are supposed to be wet. That is the single defining fact about them. The one thing every child learns in school. The one thing every tourist expects when they climb aboard an airboat outside Miami. 1.5 million acres of standing water, saw grass stretching to the horizon, alligators gliding through channels that have existed for thousands of years. It is the largest subtropical wetland in North America, and it does not burn, except right now just outside one of the most densely populated metropolitan areas in the United States. More than 11,000 acres of that wetland have been reduced to scorched black earth, and military helicopters are circling overhead, dumping water on flames that should not exist. The fire has a name. They called it the Max Road Fire, and it started on Sunday afternoon, May the 10th, near a place called Max Fish Camp off Chrome Avenue in western Broward County. Florida Forest Service investigators are still trying to determine the exact ignition point, but what happened after ignition did not require any investigation at all, because anyone living within 50 miles of it could see it with their own eyes. Within hours, the fire had consumed several hundred acres. By Monday morning, it had passed 4,800. By Monday night, it had more than doubled to 11,000 acres gone in a single day.
Yeah, there's a fire on the stretch.
The thick gray smoke from it was visible from downtown Miami, drifting north across Alligator Alley, hanging in the air like something the city had never been asked to breathe before. Drivers along U.S. Highway 27 started pulling over to photograph the flames from the shoulder of the road. Pembroke Pines police had to issue an emergency warning because the rubberneckers were creating dangerous traffic backups along the highway. People were stopping to stare at something their brains could not quite process. The swamp was on fire. But here's the sentence that should genuinely concern you, and it comes directly from the National Drought Monitor released earlier this week. The vast majority of the state of Florida is currently under exceptional or extreme drought conditions. Parts of the Everglades themselves, the wetland, the swamp, the place defined by standing water, are in extreme drought. The water that normally keeps the Everglades wet is simply gone. What is left behind is dry sawgrass, dry peat, and dry organic soil, which when it catches fire does not just burn at the surface, it burns downward, into the ground itself. Underground fires in dried-out peatlands can smolder for weeks, sometimes months, popping back up to the surface long after firefighters have moved on. That is the nightmare scenario that Florida is currently sitting on top of. By Monday afternoon, the response had stopped looking like a local fire department call-out and had started looking like a military operation. 2 Florida National Guard helicopters were making repeated water drops over the blaze. The Broward Sheriff's Office launched its own aerial resources to support the air attack. Ground crews from the Florida Forest Service, Miami-Dade Fire Rescue, and Pembroke Pines Fire Department were stationed across multiple staging points around the perimeter. Pembroke Pines police were positioned in nearby communities watching for any sign that the flames might jump containment lines. This was not a brush fire anymore. This was a coordinated wildland firefighting operation happening less than a 30-minute drive from more than 5 million people.
Everglades are on fire.
And the communities in the path of it were not in some remote wilderness. They were normal South Florida neighborhoods, Pembroke Pines, Weston. The Holly Lake mobile home community sat directly in the smoke path, and residents stepped outside Monday morning to find ash coating their cars and the smell of burning peat clinging to everything. The Everglades Holiday Park near Weston, a major tourist destination that runs airboat tours through the wetlands, was forced to shut down operations entirely. In nearby subdivisions, wind direction became a topic of obsessive conversation. People were running garden hoses over their backyards, wetting down lawns, preparing for something they had never once imagined they would need to prepare for, all while watching news helicopters circle above the flames on their TV screens. And then the situation changed. While the firefight in Broward County was still unfolding, a second fire ignited south of the main blaze in Miami-Dade County near the town of Florida City. They named it the 172nd Avenue Fire. It burned 300 acres almost immediately, and authorities had to close Card Sound Road. Containment hovered stubbornly around 50%. This was no longer one wildfire. This was two simultaneous wildfires in two different counties in the same drought-stricken ground. The message coming out of the Florida Forest Service was blunt. Since the fall, the state had been operating in extremely dry conditions. Any spark, a discarded cigarette, a downed power line, a lightning strike, even a hot piece of equipment dragged across dry ground could ignite a fire of this scale. Florida had already recorded nearly 2,000 wildfires in 2026 alone. 2,000. And it was only May. By Tuesday morning, the Max Road fire had grown to 11,339 acres, but containment had climbed to 70%. By that evening, some reports were putting it at 80. The progress was real. The wind had shifted in a favorable direction. The aerial water drops were working, and residents in Holly Lake started reporting that they could no longer smell the smoke. The skies over Pembroke Pines began to clear. For the first time in 3 days, people in western Broward could open their windows without the air burning their throats. The immediate emergency was slowly beginning to ease. But nobody following this story carefully should be reaching for relief just yet, because the Max Road fire is not the problem. The Max Road fire is a symptom of the problem. The Florida Everglades is home to 36 federally listed threatened and endangered species, including the Florida panther, the West Indian manatee, the American crocodile, and the wood stork. It provides drinking water to roughly 9 million people across South Florida. It acts as a natural filtration system that no human technology has ever been able to replicate, and it is drying out. Decades of canal building, agricultural runoff, and urban sprawl, compounded now by climate-driven drought, have left vast sections of this wetland literally too dry to function as a wetland. When the peat dries, it dies. When the sawgrass dries, it ignites. And the very ecosystem that is supposed to be incapable of burning becomes, under extreme drought conditions, one of the most flammable stretches of ground in the southeastern United States. And this is happening in May, not August, not the peak of the dry season, May, which means the worst is almost certainly still ahead. Florida's wildfire season typically runs through June, sometimes into July, until the summer rains finally arrive. The long-range forecasts for South Florida are not promising. The drought is not breaking, the temperatures are climbing. Every single day without significant rainfall is another day of fuel drying out under the Florida sun. Fire officials have been blunt about what they expect. More fires, larger fires, and likely closer to populated areas than this one came. The Max Road fire happened in a relatively isolated section of the western Everglades. The next one might not be so generous. There is also a question that almost nobody is asking out loud. What happens when wildfires like this start happening every single year? What happens when the Everglades stops being a wetland during the dry season and starts being a tinderbox, because the second-order effects are catastrophic? Tourism in South Florida is a $40 billion industry, and the Everglades is one of its centerpieces. The Florida real estate market is built on the assumption that the swamps to the west are stable, manageable, and predictable. The agricultural sectors surrounding the Everglades, sugar, citrus, vegetables, cattle, depends on a regional water table that wildfires of this scale can permanently alter. When the Everglades burns, it does not just lose trees and grass. It loses soil, it loses water storage capacity. It loses the very biological infrastructure that makes South Florida habitable in the first place.
The picture don't do that justice, RT.
Sure doesn't.
Tonight, the Max Road fire is mostly contained. The military helicopters are returning to base. The road closures are being lifted. The Everglades Holiday Park is preparing to reopen its airboat tours, and the residents of Holly Lake are sleeping a little easier. The smoke is clearing from the skies above Miami. The 172nd Avenue fire in Miami-Dade is still burning, still being worked, still creeping along at around 50% containment. But by the standards of how this week began, the worst of the immediate emergency has passed. For now. Because somewhere in the western Everglades right now, the peat is still smoldering, the ground is still dry, the next spark is still out there waiting for the wind to shift the wrong way, and every firefighter, every forester, every emergency manager in the state of Florida knows the same thing tonight. This is not the last wildfire of 2026. It is not even close. It is just the first one big enough that the rest of the country finally noticed. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.